An Existential Tale. Chapter 2. The Maelstrom. The days at sea were not as arduous nor as toiling as Elizabeth expected, or, for that matter, desired them to be, and instead were pleasant and remained relatively uneventful, save for the occasional anomaly, which was a grand but brief interruption on what was otherwise a continued, banal existence, but was, in fairness to other anomalies, quite insignificant. Being that every day was practically equal in such regards, she progressed quickly to the point of struggling for ways to occupy her mind, and, as a result, the days seemed instead to drone forth at half pace, if she were lucky, and slower if she were not so fortunate. It was a strange but notable occurrence, which Elizabeth observed, and, after much consideration, came to the conclusion that the precepts of time were held to a less rigid standard when not on solid land. It made sense if one thought about it. Time on land passes most generally in a straight fashion. There are mountains and valleys which obturate time's movement, but nothing so extreme that has not been accustomed to, and so far as accounted for, that the phenomenon is hardly noticeable to those such inclined. So, while it may take longer for time to reach the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro, or other beings of prodigious stature, it surely makes up the difference on the vast Siberian plains. Though there are yet any who have reached such heights and been able to examine the matter firsthand. In those regards, the discrepancies even out in the end, with the notion that it may take longer than perfect flatness, but those inland have become accustomed to the inconvenience, which, all things considered, is insignificant compared to the likes of the sea, whose only idleness comes in momentary waves spread out far too often and with varied inconsistency, which, while expected, is none the less a great inconvenience for time. Having to traverse the crests and troughs of each wave leaves little doubt as to its retardedness, thereby delaying its arrival considerably when compared to its adopted schedule on land. Or so it seemed to Elizabeth, who had ample time to think of such things. A mean result was that the days passed slowly and left Elizabeth more time than she was accustomed to, which primarily went towards dwelling on the difference. All of which would not have been so bad, and, under different circumstances, Elizabeth may have enjoyed herself. But, as she previously feared, she found herself constantly under the guardianship of Miss Bumble. The first days were among the worst, for Miss Bumble was still overtly concerned with the morality of the seamen, and did not so much as let Elizabeth leave her side. Elizabeth pressed on, however, having no chance to press backwards, sideways, or diagonally. She at one time thought about pressing backwards, being the most practical of the alternatives, diving off and trying to swim back to harbor. But upon farther consideration, it was an awfully long distance, and she did not think she had the stamina to make it. The longer she thought about it, the farther the ship moved from the shore, making the swim even harder. With it, so dwindled her chance of success until the thought completely faded from her mind. Or so she thought her stamina was better used in resisting the suffering of her condition than idyllic fancies, sure to, if not go wrong, then trend noticeably in that direction. With little options available, Elizabeth suffered on, though there was little to do on the ship. So to her it seemed each day would hardly cease, and her only hope came in the brief but potential respite when she looked forward to each coming day with promise it would somehow be different to the current one. Then, only to find to her great dismay, with raised expectations, so too came great disappointment, as each day bled into the next in an indistinguishable fashion, creating an almost perpetual malaise Elizabeth had little choice but to embrace, or seek the occasional refuge by claiming sanctuary with the ship's captain, who, knowing her plight, was sympathetic to her misery. But what was to her dismay was to the crew and the captain something greatly cherished, and they in no means wished to see altered. So far everything went as expected, or how nearly anyone would expect it to go under the most ideal conditions. The waters were fair, the wind held firm at their backs, and they made good time. To the crew, which included the captain, consisted of the first mate, a doctor, a cook, an old sailor, and an assortment of 12 other seamen who, to Elizabeth's eye, found it very hard to differentiate between. All was well, or so they were prone to saying. But for Elizabeth, who knew very little of nautical matters, they may very well have been merely presumptuous boastings, For if they, by chance, had been traveling completely in the wrong direction, she would have hardly known the difference. The voyage had been fair. That so much she knew, though it was a notion in no way she was forced to commit to memory, for she was near constantly reminded of the fact by the crew, in case she should by some means forget. It was an effective quality they all possessed, so whenever she passed, they would talk of the ease of the voyage, and seemingly nothing else. That, and the peculiarly favored wind they possessed. "Today we have a good wind, but tomorrow will be better," they said with unjust sanguinity, each in a different way, but the same none the less. Then one or two more would lend their support, nod along silently, or in instances of the cook being near, who had the odd habit of only replying in the affirmative with grunts of "God," followed shortly after by the very proximity of the cliff, being far more often narrow than prodigious, which itself would often lead to a continued awkward conversation, which most thought a bearable trait due to the above-average gruel he produced tried daily to great acclaim. The hemming and hawing of agreement would continue back and forth, before a third would quiet the optimism by claiming it was already too much of a good thing, and that they should wait and see, then knowingly make a precognition. "It was a good day, and tomorrow may be better, but let us see it first, then be grateful, for the sea is known to be fickle. I would as soon embrace what good fortune she has without expecting to continue to receive it," he would say while looking to the distant sea, at some invisible monolith the others could not yet perceive. The rest would solemnly agree, and then go back to work while the thoughts built up inside until they could no longer contain them, and the process repeated henceforth. This happened no less than twice an hour, and, on the most pleasant of days, hardly any work could be done, for the men were constantly remarking about the weather. The fairness of the journey was not altogether lost on her, but, there being little to do on the ship that appealed to her, Elizabeth was not able to fully enjoy the experience. She tried reading her book. At first it was difficult, as the mere sight of it made her think of her father. But eventually, spurred by idleness, she recovered and pressed forth with idle-sprung resolve. The rest of the time was just as uneventful. She ate thrice daily, and afterwards tried her best to avoid Miss Bumble, so her lessons would not continue. Unfortunately for her, however hard she tried, it was as if Miss Bumble had an innate talent for locating her, though, being confined to the ship, there are only a finite number of places to hide. Not to suggest Miss Bumble was incompetent in her searching. Far from it. She was particularly dedicated to the matter. She would scour the ship, saying, "It's only a matter of time until I find you. If you finish with your lessons, you can have the rest of the day to yourself." Though this was hardly true, for one day Elizabeth tried, and with great effort finished her dailies prior to noon, expecting to be greeted with the rest of the day free from educational encumbrance, and being able to do as she wanted, or, as she chose to do, nothing. In her mind, this worked out wonderfully well, but was difficult to implement practically, for she was not greeted with the luxurious freedom promised. Instead, no sooner than she had finished her work, and even before she was able to lay her pen down, allowing her hand the much-needed time to recoup, Miss Bumble was there to suggest, since having made such great progress, she should not let the opportunity escape, as Elizabeth learned that day potential energy was prone to doing, and that her momentum would never be the same otherwise, and continue her studies. Elizabeth did not agree, but was in no position to voice her opposition, having no chance to convince Miss Bumble otherwise. So Elizabeth, after stretching, set back to work on other tedious matters. After that day, Elizabeth felt as if her head would explode. She had so much new knowledge, she was quite certain it was bad for her. She reasoned, and rightfully so. A person could only hold so much information before some of it had to be expelled. Like a glass of water overflowing, there was only so much that could be held before the effort was wasted. Then she had a terrible thought. What if the new information replaced the old ones? A terrible thought indeed. What if it was something she needed? How foolish she would look if she could not remember how to eat, and, instead, could only say facts about Habsburgs. What if it was worse, and she forgot how to breathe? She was very aware of her breathing, and feared if she stopped thinking about it, then she may stop altogether. What a fine use the new knowledge would be when she was rolling on the floor, blue in the face. She could imagine it now. With her last breath, She would give her opinion of Robert Walpole and the merits of Otranto. What a fine lady she would be then, as she lied on the floor gasping for breath. After that, she resolved, to the best of her ability, she would try to abstain from an overabundance of new information. For some was not bad, but one must allow it to settle and ruminate so that it would be unlikely to exceed one's natural limitations. This newfound creed made ample sense to Elizabeth, and was what she henceforth strived to live by, though Miss Bumble was not very fond of this resolution. So, to the best of her ability, which with the new knowledge she possessed was somewhat less than before, Elizabeth sought to do the absolute best she could to prevent herself from gaining new knowledge in what she deemed an unreasonable fashion, by any means necessary, and instead go about it in slow but persistent bursts, allowing her mind to expand and create new room so that it might have a place to go. This generally involved hiding and, if available, general obtrusification of Miss Bumble, though it only proved a slight hindrance to the otherwise competent Miss Bumble. For no matter how well she hid, it was only a matter of time before she was discovered and chastised for her immature behavior. You are in my charge, and while that might not mean anything to you, it means a great deal to me. If you are determined to go through life as an oaf, then it will be, but not on my watch. You must wait until you are older, and much more qualified, before you become a cultural abomination. Miss Bumble droned on, but Elizabeth quit listening and thought of other things. Perhaps she could just jump into the sea. It would not be that bad. With some luck, she would come upon an island, where a ship could rescue her. Are you paying attention? Miss Bumble looked at Elizabeth suspiciously. Elizabeth nodded, and Miss Bumble continued her lecture until she thought she had talked enough, at which point she sought to guide Elizabeth back to study once more. This attempted guidance coincided near the same moment Elizabeth came to the conclusion it would be too far to swim, and decided to follow her instead. But this was not yet the end to the ordeal, for Elizabeth remained unsatisfied with the supposed compromise. So in a fit of insubordination, Elizabeth sought to exaggerate her condition with the hope that Miss Bumble would realize the torment she placed on her. This was primarily done as she pretended to be damaged from the abundance of new information. After studying for periods she deemed too long, she would walk about into the door while saying, "What was this called again? An oar? A oar? I cannot remember. What was the letter between C and E? Though did you know the Battle of Hastings was in A.D. 1066? A.D. stands for Anno Domini. Anno Domini is Latin for the year of the Lord." Elizabeth suddenly stopped and stared blankly outwards for a short time before she started stating trivial facts indefinitely, all the while walking into the door, occasionally remarking that there was something wrong with the oar, or that it was malfunctioning. This greatly frustrated Miss Bumble, who instead of compromising, only sought to reteach her the things she had forgotten, however tedious the process may be. Though being a remarkable pupil, Elizabeth picked up the lost information again rather quickly, before she was forced to renew her studies. Such was her life, with only momentary glimpses of freedom in between. When she did have time to herself, she liked to stand on the deck and watch the sea. She had seen maps and knew roughly where they were, and how far they had yet to go, but the sea seemed infinite when she was amongst it. She wondered who would have had the courage to initially venture out into the unknown. They were the ones who made the maps and brought back tales of giants in the mountains and leviathans in the sea. She had even heard of one man who had met talking horses in a far-off land, though when he came back, he murdered several people to make shoes. It was all very frightening, and made her question whether the insanity came naturally or as a result of his adventures. It was a dangerous business, adventuring, she thought. If it were up to her, she would have just fabricated a map, simply draw a few lines with squiggles here and there, and then make it very clear that it is a dangerous place. Maybe put a sea monster or two around it, so no one in their right mind would go there. Oh, what a fine explorer she would be. When she returned, she would be greeted as a hero. To think of the parties she would attend, the people she would meet, and the gallantry of it all. It was almost too much to bear. She must remember her etiquette lessons. Was she to curtsy once or twice for the Queen? Probably twice at minimum, for she was the Queen, though she could not remember with certainty. What was she thinking? After her adventure, the Queen would certainly bow to her. She was nearly the same age as George, relatively speaking. She knew that they would be friends. After all, who would not want to be friends with her? No one she would want to be friends with. That was for sure, she thought. They would have so very much to talk about, both being well-traveled and accustomed to the sea. Oh, the parties they would go to together, the sights they would see, and when they were apart, her to continue her adventures, and him to protect the seas. They would write letters to let the other know of their deeds and how they fared. She would be fast friends with them all. Louise, Toria, and she would all do so many marvelous things together. She was sure of it, though the intention was not passed to Eddie. From what she heard, he seemed a bit queer, and was not particularly excited to meet him, a sentiment he no doubt shared. These daydreams persisted for a while, before she grew tired of such thoughts, which she imagined everyone did, for even in her imagination it was difficult not offending anyone. Retaining the proper etiquette proved the most troublesome. How you had to call so-and-so this and someone else that. It was all very confusing. Remembering whose honorary title was a necessity, while whose was only for show. Not to even mention who was currently in a fight with whom. It could easily get out of hand, and it often did. She felt it was too complicated for her, so she dismissed these notions, thankful they were only in her mind, and did not have any more tangible consequences. Once these dreams faded, she looked for other ways to pass the time, which initially came by watching birds as they flew along the ship for the first few days, until they decided they were no longer traveling the proper course, and, upon changing their angle, departed from the ship. Their numbers slowly dwindled as they delved farther into the sea, until at last they exceeded the threshold so deemed the point of no return, for they were seldom seen after that, save for the occasional albatross, which, for a time, hovered around near constantly. It had been 2 days since she last saw a bird, and now, due to the lack of any other entertainment, she had taken to counting the waves as they waded against the ship. They came in a series of 9, she was told, and it was mostly true, save for the rare occasion when she could not quite determine with absolute certainty that the 5th wave was larger than the 4th, and when the 7th seemed smaller than the 6th. Then there were times when the 2nd and 3rd appeared indistinguishable. So she took their word on the matter. She could not remember who told her this, or where she had learned it, so she attributed it to common knowledge, and thought that, in that instance, it was most certainly true enough as not to be considered too odd. Though it proved to be a difficult assertion to disprove, as she would need a way to pause the waves and walk upon water to obtain a proper measurement. But even if by chance she was able to, by that time the ship would have long since passed, and even if she were able to catch up, she certainly would not make it out without being completely and utterly drenched. So she thought she would never know the true discrepancy between the waves. Or so was a common daily occurrence. Then in the morning, Elizabeth would awaken, and the day would repeat once more, with only slight variances, as otherwise would suggest inscrutability. As each day was nearly identical to the last, and the day that had yet to come, it became difficult to tell not only where she was, but also when she was as well. On the 7th day at sea, which Elizabeth only recognized from her calendar, she gained near complete independence. Miss Bumble, having succumbed to sickness brought on by the food, which she described quite succinctly to the cook as not fit for a dog, the constant rocking of the ship, or some combination of the two, was confined to her bed for the remainder of the trip. "The dog seemed to enjoy it," the cook replied, pointing to his hound, lying in the corner, asleep and unaware of its topic being broached. "And some of us like 'em better," he said under his breath. "That thing's alive? I haven't seen it move since we've been here." "Well, some know when it's best to neither be seen nor heard." Miss Bumble did not take kindly to any of the cook's words, but especially his last. She left amid a bevy of insults and declarations of ill fortune levied forth, before being spurred on to leave by a faint but noticeable rumbling of her stomach. "God, that was a narrow clip," the cook said as Miss Bumble stormed from the hall, holding both her stomach and her mouth. The occurrence had given Elizabeth more free time than she was used to. So much she had little use for it. In time she ran out of things to do, and eventually resorted to doing her studies so she would have something to take her mind off her idleness, a fact she was sure Miss Bumble was pleased about. But even this expired, and she was forced to occupy her own time once again, which occurred in several ways. She once composed a letter to her father. "Dearest Father, Miss Felicity's illness, while initially absent, has spectacularly reappeared. It was a welcome respite from her tedium, but now I am almost lost without her constant bickering. I do not know if she will pull through. If it comes to it, and a replacement is needed, then I would recommend equipping my hat with a bell. I believe there would hardly be a difference in what I am subjected to. Whenever I walk, it shall ring, and I will be constantly reminded, no matter the situation, that I am currently in the wrong, and should instead be engaged in scholarly efforts. I am certain the bell would be both remarkably cheaper, and would sound much more pleasant than Miss Felicity's shrill voice. I might even eventually come to accept the bell as a perpetuality of my existence. Everyone would know of my approach, so that they can prepare as desired. Those that do not favor my countenance could leave, and I would not have to bear their presence, leaving only my true friends to enjoy my company. A great thing to have a bell. I think all should be so fortunate. Elizabeth had no way of sending the letter, so she folded it up and placed it in her book. The captain said they would be stopping soon, and she would try to send it then, though he was not exact in his answers, and whenever Elizabeth pressed the matter, he only responded in increasingly vague terms. That was until one night, after the evening porridge, the captain pulled Elizabeth aside and spoke to her in private. "Tomorrow we'll make a brief stop to resupply. This should not be much of an inconvenience, except you know this is a working ship, and that some things are expected of it, while others aren't. So, when we are searched, it may be best for everyone if you and your friend were absent during the inspection. That way we can make sure there are no problems. It shouldn't take more than a few hours. Plenty of time for you to walk about and see the city." Elizabeth agreed, thinking it would do both her and Miss Bumble some good to be free of the ship for at least one afternoon. The following morning came quickly, or so it seemed to Elizabeth, for she had something to look forward to, and soon the shore could be seen in the distance. Elizabeth, Miss Bumble, and the captain stood side by side on the deck as the coast came into shape. When it appeared fully, the captain pointed forth and said, "Do you see that? It's hard to believe that only a few years ago that was not there as it is now. But you wouldn't believe that if I told you. You're much too smart for that. You see, that has been there for as long as anything has. Just by calling it a new name doesn't change what it is." They had little time to take in the view, as they were ushered to a skiff where they, accompanied by a stout seaman, departed from the main ship and rowed towards the city. Miss Bumble took a parasol with her off the ship, which she carried in public no matter the occasion, due to her saying that it had more uses than to stop the rain. From the docks they made their way to a bazaar near the center of the city, where Elizabeth searched for necklaces, combs, and other practical items, while Miss Bumble followed her, and occasionally looked at rings with only one eye, for the other was constantly surveying for potential trouble. It was fortunate Miss Bumble had such a wandering eye. Otherwise she would not have seen the thief coming nor him leaving with her purse. Or, it should be said, his attempt, for his exodus was opposed by Miss Bumble, who was quite literally unwilling to let it go, and instead proceeded to beat the attempted thief with her parasol to a pulp, where it was thought by all the spectators that he, by far, got the worst of the encounter. The impediment, however, did not hinder the rest of the day, and the two continued exploring the market for any so-called deals they could find. After spending the entire day, and only finding a few, though not one worth mentioning, they returned to the ship. Miss Bumble was initially pleased that they no longer had to deal with gypsies and other heathens, but upon first seeing the ship, regretted her prior sentiment, and longed for a return to the degenerates. Once back on the ship, they put away their collected souvenirs, after which they went to the hall where the crew had gathered for the evening gruel, which they all looked forward to after a tiring day. As they waited for the captain to arrive, each side talked of their day, Elizabeth of what she found and witnessed, while the crew complained about the weight of the boxes, along with the number they were forced to unload and load. Elizabeth thought they were prone to cavilling, for she knew that cotton weighed little, or not enough to cause so much grievance. The captain arrived soon after, and seeing Elizabeth and Miss Bumble, proceeded directly to them. "How did your adventure go?" "Ah, I'd like to know, but perhaps it's best saved for another time. There are more pressing matters I must attend to, and would like to let you know. We must deviate, slightly, from our predefined course. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but there has been a change of plans. Do not look so distraught. It should only delay us a day. We must travel up the coast of Italy. Salerno has desperate need of some of the cotton we recently acquired. There's no need to fear. We have made good time to get where we are now. Even with a day lost, we will still reach Southampton a day before scheduled." The news was not that bad, but as the word spread, the crew took the news harshly, and an aura of despair manifested. Henceforth a cloud hung over the ship, one that did not seem to dissipate and, as it lingered, only grew more so in prominence. At dinner, the men were still so encumbered they hardly talked, not even the cook, who hardly said God at all, and now stood by silently stirring his porridge. That was until the oldest of the sailors, who appeared to be in his 50s, spoke up. Everyone turned and listened to his tale in silence. "I've seen this once before, on the maiden voyage of the Desmonia. I shared with it my first journey far into the sea. I was told then by one of the men, who was not with us originally, but gathered by us to return him to his home of Geneva, so that his family might see him once more. He had some unknown illness that could not be stifled, and I, being the least senior of the crew, was assigned to watch over him. As we progressed, his condition steadily worsened. He gained shades of green daily, until he appeared more frog-like than man. I suspected it might not be long before he passed, while in the back of my mind I hoped his condition was not contagious. His will was strong, and he did not succumb completely to his affliction. Instead, he stagnated and became near catatonic for approximately a week. But as we neared the southern straits, he became more animated. So too did he overcome his virility. His color returned to his body, but not the appropriate one. His flesh turned the color of the sea." The crew looked around at each other without saying a word. They all appeared to be of a normal hue, and the only person who was the tiniest amount of green was Miss Bumble, who they all eyed suspiciously. "But with it, so too did his speech return," continued the sailor. "He at first appeared in an agitated state, rambling on about life beneath the sea, though slowly he became more translucent, and the matters became more pronounced. That was until we passed nearest the Balkans, so that the mountains loomed before us, and he transitioned to a transcendental state. His speech returned. Each word was as clear as ever before. But still his words did not make sense, if that itself makes any sense. In that brief respite of clarity, he told me what happened on the maiden voyage of the Cetus. We at the time were between Scylla and Charybdis, yet we hardly knew it when he said to me, seemingly by chance, we became lodged onto some foreign object at sea, so that the ship came to an abrupt stop. We were initially confused, as there should be nothing close to the surface to impede us in such a way. We had little time to wonder, for soon the cause emerged. From the abysmal plains sprang forth a prodigious chthonic beast, for no such thing had ever had resemblance on earth. It appeared, a mass of withering tentacles, larger than the ship tenfold. The tentacles, each elongated to an unnatural degree, thrashed about, engulfing the ship with sharpened claws that could cut a man in half, and hooks that dug into the bone, as we did our best to ward off the beast, by throwing spears and slashing at its appendages. We struggled valiantly, but it was a futile endeavor, and only a matter of time before we were expunged from existence by the countless polypi as they emerged from the sea. The sight was nauseating, as it set about strangling the ship, splashing the sea and burst above the mast. Green-gray mist filled the air, as chthonic ooze dripped from the beast, and yet I watched on memorized by its magnificence, as the men around me fell to its twisted machinations. Not the worst by far has been spoken. He said it was an abomination of the vilest sort. We managed to break free momentarily, and hastened to retreat, but it was no use. As before, we had only been able to see its limbs, and the true horror remained foreign to us. It emerged from the sea in its entirety. It held the shape of a monstrous squid, but only in the face, for a body even more fearsome was attached. It had the body of a dragon, and, like a dragon, the beast had wings extending from his torso. As we fled, they unfurled from the sea, pushing the mist around us once more, before the giant wings submerged and propelled the beast through the water faster than anything known, and soon it had the Cetus in its grasp once more. We broke free at great cost, and at the sacrifice of the first mate. Still, the Leviathan proceeded. It was swifter than the ship, that we knew for sure. The captain, one of the few not injured, and still of sound mind, ordered the ship to be turned around and towards the beast. Acting on instinct, the remaining crew obeyed and the ship rammed the monstrosity. The prow impelled the beast, and we knew we had damaged it, for it let out a blood-curdling howl, giving us time to escape as the beast returned to its home beneath the sea. What the creature took by force was doubled afterwards. Of all that breathed the noxious fumes, none survived. Only their deaths were delayed as the poison took root. I believe those that died that day were lucky compared to the atrocities suffered by those initially deemed more fortunate, as their minds were corrupted from the inconceivability of it all. So too is my fate. I know it now, and make no protest. Do not pity me, for I have stared into the eyes of insanity and returned once more. I only ask for you one thing. Bury me at sea, so that I might share my dreams with the monster. Those were his last words. How true or not, I don't know. Only that he was certain of it, I remain convinced. After that, he grew increasingly agitated, before eventually passing away. I'm glad, for now he might find some peace. The sailor paused for a significant time, while everyone thought to themselves, before he spoke once more. It seems now, too, we are between Scylla and Charybdis. The crew remained silent, and these were the last words spoken before the crew slowly returned to their duties. The rest of the night was filled with silence as everyone's thoughts remained on the Tell, as did Elizabeth, whose mind continued to wander, even as she tried to go to sleep. Chthonic beasts? She thought them unlikely, or that if they were real, a great many people, including herself, would not be able to accept the fact, and go insane due to the incomprehensibleness of it. But above all else the words, "We are between Scylla and Charybdis," echoed in her mind. It's only a cruel joke. There is nothing to fear, or so she told herself, as the wind, sea, and ship made, in conjecture with each other, a noisome banter. She had heard those words before, but thought it was only a story, and she knew they were nowhere near the Strait of Messina. If only we were to have the fortune of Jason, she thought, though one can hardly count on a Nereid when one's life is on the line. They, being accustomed to the sea, must truly run near constantly late. After hours lost in thought, Elizabeth finally drifted off to sleep. Her dreams were influenced by the Tell, but were not all bad, as she dreamed of a city beneath the sea. The morning sun just peeked above the horizon when the shouts first echoed through the ship, waking Elizabeth from her dreams. She ran out onto the deck to determine the cause of the commotion. "Look alive!" yelled the captain, as he stood on the upper deck, looking westward, while his scarf whipped back and forth against the surging wind, "or we may not be here for much longer." From the west, the storm grew increasingly violent, and moved towards the ship, as the ship trudged forward to meet it. "I'll not sacrifice any of my men, not today nor tomorrow," yelled the captain to inspire the crew, who were already fully motivated by the oncoming storm. Their light-hearted nature fell aside, and a grave look took over. They ran about the ship with fluidity and ease, scrambling with frantic purpose, until, at last, they succeeded in circumventing the storm, and, for a moment, as the weather calmed, they thought the worst was behind them. The wind stopped, and there was silence. Each sailor basked in their triumph, until there came a horrible, continuous roaring, loud enough to stir them from their daydreaming. The sound rushed forth in a fury and lingered, like a strong gust of wind that was somehow sustained and never ended. As they gazed out to the sea to locate the source of the noise, a grayish tint swirled up from the unknown depths and mingled with the clear blue waters. Initially, only one sailor saw the vortex. He stood there transfixed by its magnitude. Others joined him, and were frozen at the sight, seeing in the distance the ocean swirl viciously around itself. The vortex widened from the depths into a cone shape, where the bottom was narrow and confined, while the top spread out to an almost perfect circle. Its movement circled, till the sustained velocity created an optical illusion, so that it looked like it hardly moved at all. That was until the first article of debris hit the edge, at which point the circle folded in on itself, momentarily giving the appearance that it had been stopped, while the sound too ceased. Where the crew, for the first, but also fleeting time, faces lit up with hope before the Maelstrom sucked the debris down, swallowing it whole, then returned back to its previous condition and searched for more to consume, as the crew looked on awestruck. Their mesmerization was broken only by the yells of the captain. "Turn the mast! Get with the wind! God damn it! It'll be hell before this is my last day," he yelled. Then, running out of options, conceded, "Toss the freight to buy us some time." The crates exploded into fragments when they hit the water before being pulled inward, in different degrees based on their size. The smaller pieces went without a struggle, though there were many grouped together. They fought back so that it looked like choppy water, for they were pulled down. The larger pieces were perhaps the most unlucky, as they lingered on the outskirts of the vortex, circling round in perpetual worry, as the smaller pieces were directly consumed, leaving them little time to fret. Its hunger never quenched, its emptiness never impeded by the countless offerings of the sea. The vortex swallowed more, without an end in sight. The sound came forth like a roaring storm, and when it devoured, like rolling thunder. Except there was no end. The sound was continuous, and only grew more pronounced as they approached. Soon the larger pieces found their way to the center, where they were lifted into the air before being pulled down, so that in one instance they were nearly perpendicular to the sea, standing vertical where only the lesser end touched the water, and in the next they had disappeared completely. It reminded Elizabeth of a bath being drained. She had wondered where the water went, but she never had any intention of finding out this way, or in such a direct manner. The crew scurried off to their tasks while Miss Bumble and Elizabeth went inside, where they clutched to the corner of the hull, thinking not that it was safer, but that it better not to look at their impending doom, which might make it more bearable. Miss Bumble held Elizabeth in her arms as she kept repeating, "Don't worry, I'm sure everything is going to be okay," though she was saying the words more so to herself than for Elizabeth's benefit. The vessel rocked violently back and forth against the waves and writhed against the sea as it was pulled closer to the center of the vortex. The sails swung from their frame and the crew bolted to and fro, trying to maintain their hopes of survival. They flung ropes about the mast, tying knots with fluidity as mounting waves splashed over the guardrail. They had maintained the best they could. That is all they had accomplished, and in doing so only delayed the inevitable. No progress had been made, and they remained within the pull of the vortex. Still, they strived forward and continued, hoping to delay their fate so that they might outwait the sea, knowing the end must be soon, and each action bought them more precious time, as each second was an eternity, and they strived to live forever in the face of such a monstrosity. Soon, they found though the ship faced north, they headed east. The sailors then gave up, as now it was beyond their control, and, instead, they hoped the source would fill up with water, and not have enough room for them as well. Such are the idle hopes of hopeless men. The Maelstrom did not cease. If anything, it grew stronger. Or so it was from their perspective, as they grew closer in a continual loop, with each passing rotation, to the center of the vortex. The captain yelled once more, "Do you see the rocks? We have passed them 10 times by now. Malcolm, you are the strongest. Do you think you could throw the anchor upon those rocks?" It was a wild speculation, but one they could not ignore. Malcolm picked up the anchor and spun it above his head as the ship made its way towards an outcropping of rocks once more. He had but one chance, which crept into his mind as he waited. When they neared enough, he threw the chain with all his might and watched as it sailed before landing amongst the rocks. The crew waited in anticipation before seeing the anchor catch, the chain grow taut, and the ship come to a sudden halt. The vortex continued. With its might now fully on the bow of the ship, it pulled the bow down with such great force that by doing so, propelled the stern upwards, pushing it out of the water and forcing the bow deeper into the sea. The ship's momentum stopped before growing fully perpendicular, put a great strain on the frame of the ship. The ship was not built to sustain that type of trauma, and it was a wonder it held for as long as it did, but the sound of cracking wood signaled it had reached its threshold. The oak splintered, sending fractured beams shooting into the sky until the stern of the ship gave way and plummeted towards the water, while the bow popped up from the force into the air momentarily, before colliding back to the surface. The ship broke into 2 near-identical pieces, one precariously attached to the rocks, the other circling the vortex. Elizabeth remained on the stern of the ship, but during the confusion she had become disoriented and lost track of Miss Bumble. Luckily, this half of the ship still remained attached to the rocks, though it no longer had the buoyancy to support itself. Elizabeth tried to hang on, but, as the water rushed in, the force pulled her from the ship. She took a deep breath before she submerged and was pulled deeper and deeper into the sea. Suddenly it stopped. In an instant, the force that had been to so many a source of consternation had suddenly and inexplicably subsided. Elizabeth did not have time to consider such things, as she was still under water. She tried to move towards the surface. The sea was much darker this far down, and, combined with the dislodged mud, she hardly could tell which direction she faced, though she spotted a glimmer of light towards the surface. She tried to swim up, but, despite her efforts, she seemed to make no progress. She looked down to see a chain caught on her foot. She reached for it, trying to knock it loose. It fell to the bottom of the sea. She watched it drift downwards until it passed from sight and entered a vast gloom. She had little time to waste. She looked up and could nearly see the surface. She thought she could make it, though each moment she lingered, the more difficult the task became. Without hesitating any longer, she swam upwards as her breath grew thin. She kicked her legs frantically, as panic set in at her lack of progress. It seemed hopeless. She began to sink as the air fell from her lungs. She gasped for breath and inhaled a bit of water instead, which burned her lungs, making her wince from the pain. She looked up once more. The surface had faded from sight. In the midst of the gloom, her vision grew blurry until her eyes glassed over from the unjust strain placed upon her. She succumbed to the force, and her sight grew dim. She closed her eyes one last time, and when she opened them again, she could hardly tell the difference. The sea was as black as night. Her resolve diminished, and with it, her hopes and dreams faded, and she found herself at the mercy of the sea.